Last week we talked about money. I hate it. But we're going to get through this series. Last week we talked about giving our first 10% to God. Is it hot in here? Is anybody else hot?
Yeah.
If somebody don't mind turning this fan on right here. Brian Brediger, I hate to single you out. But I'm about to burn up. It's probably because we're talking about money, and I just hate it. But today we're going to talk about savings. I'm just going to be quick again. You know, as a whole, as a country, we have not done good in planning for our futures. The national savings rate is about the same as what we saw during Pat Nance's time during the Great Depression, okay? I mean, that's what the national savings rate is like today. We have not seen such low numbers since the Great Depression. In 2022, the national average American spent 99.8% of their income. Newsweek says that 70% of all Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Proverbs chapter 21 says that a wise man saves for the future. But hey, we know that can be a challenge, can't it? Especially if you're a young family with kids. That can be hard. But in Luke chapter 12, Jesus is going to teach us a little bit about savings. He says this. Jesus says this. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of man. Don't get too concerned about what man thinks of you, because what power do they have over you? You worry about what God thinks, because He has the power to throw you into hell. I had somebody, I was telling them there in Sunday school, I had somebody walk out last week and they said, Kurt, you did about the best job I've ever heard a preacher talking about money. And he said, I know that a lot of people would rather hear you talk about hell than about money. If you've been in church long, the one thing the people in church, people don't like to hear a preacher talk about is they don't want to hear you talk about hell. But I believe it's true. Y'all would rather hear me preach about hell than about money. Well, right here, what's going on is there's this man in the crowd. And in verse 13, he asked this question of Jesus. He says, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. It's a little background. What's going on here is there's a little bit of fighting in this family over the subject of finances. Now, I know that never happens in y'all's homes, right? That never happens in any of y'all's marriages, right? Y'all never fight about money. But this man, what it boils down to is he wanted to make sure he was going to get his fair share of the inheritance. It's like that old saying, where there is a will, there is a relative. You know what I mean? Where there is a will, you better believe a relative is going to come out of nowhere. So the younger brother is like, Jesus, can you just tell him to split it with me? There's a few things I want y'all to catch from this interaction with this man and Jesus. The first is this. This man comes to Jesus for financial guidance. That's rare. Most of us, if we're honest, at times of our lives, we avoid letting Jesus get close to our money. I was reading this story about the Knights of, well, it got me into it is I love the Hatfields and McCoys. Y'all ever heard about them? You know, I was raised in West Virginia. West Virginia is like home to me. I love it there. It's beautiful. You know what they call 32 West Virginia women locked in one room? A full set of teeth. West Virginia gets a bad rap, but it's not that bad. But the Hatfields and McCoys, Devil Anse was my hero growing up. I loved him. And if you follow the story, it's ironic to me that Randall McCoy in the beginning of the story was this fine Christian man. And Devil Anse was the devil. But throughout that story, throughout the trials and heartaches, those two characters flipped places. Randall McCoy became a sorry, terrible human being, died a drunk, lost his family, his kids, everything turned on him, the ones that remained alive. And yet Devil Anse, history is a little off on the number, but somewhere between 75 and 80 years old, became a baptized believer in the Tug Fork Christian Church. And he was baptized. But when he went down into the water, he had his pistol on him, because he always had to watch his back as long as he lived. But when the preacher baptized him, he told the preacher, I'm getting baptized with my pistol and I'm going to hold it up out of the water, because if Jesus doesn't accept me, I'll shoot him. Well, it goes to, you ever heard of something called the Knights of Templar? I know me and Willie are probably the only ones, and Daryl Lester, that like history. But the Knights of Templar, when these knights became Christians and would be baptized, they would hold their swords up out of the water. And it was a way of saying, God, you can have my life, but you're not going to have my sword. You're not going to have this area of my life. And so a lot of us, when we become Christians, we're like, God, you can have my life, you can have everything, but my money is my business, and you're not going to be involved in that. So this man comes to Jesus for financial guidance, which is something that we could look at and apply to our own lives. The second thing that happens here is this man goes to Jesus, and he doesn't just ask a question. Like he asked Jesus to agree with what he thinks about money. And he's like, Jesus, this is what I think about money. Isn't this the way it should be? And so he comes to Jesus and he's like, Jesus, this is what I think. Will you please agree with me on this? Well, by the time we get to verses 14 and 15, he says this. Jesus says to this man, he says, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kind of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And so what's going to happen now as we follow these verses is Jesus is going to tell us a parable about money. He's going to tell us a story about money. And that's not unusual at all. I don't know if you've studied this, but 16 of Jesus' 38 parables all deal with money. And the reason is because Jesus understands that a lot of us think that this life is only about getting more and more money. So by the time you get to verse 16 here on the screen and following, Jesus told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger barns, and there I will store all of my grain and all of my goods. And so here's a man that is already rich, but he gets more and more and more, and he decides that he's going to save it. He's going to hoard it up. Now there's nothing wrong with that, okay? After all, the Bible says a wise man saves for his future. You know, all of us agree that saving money is common sense. But the practice of saving money is really uncommon in today's world. We know that it is important to be saving, yet it's hard for us to put it into practice and do it. And so the Bible, like everything else, gives us some good advice in this area. The Bible says that a savings plan begins, it starts with what we talked about last week, giving the first 10% back to God. Now, as I told you in Sunday school, there's a mystery here that I cannot explain to you fully, but I have experienced it in my life. And I can also fill this stage up here with lots of people in this room that would tell you that 9/10 of their income goes farther with God involved in it than 10/10 of their income without God involved in it. The second thing that we learn from the Bible is that we should appreciate what we have. Would you agree with that? We should be thankful for what we have. You know, discontentment is one of the things that is ruining this country today, this world. Discontentment, as Dave Ramsey says, is the enemy of savings. You know, the more you have, the more you spend. And so we've got to get to this place in our lives where we're happy and we're content with what God has done for us and for what we've got right now in this moment. Happiness and contentment is not something that you can buy on your phone off the internet. Happiness and contentment is not something that you buy from the store. So we've got to learn to appreciate what God has given us. I told y'all this morning, my grandma is living with us, and it's been one of the best things in the world. Now Samantha has help with her 6 kids. And I've enjoyed hearing my grandma this week tell us, every time she sees me working around the house or working out on the land or doing anything, she's like, Kurt, You are so blessed. You have so much. You are so blessed. And I'm thinking, I don't know that I really realized it, but now I've got my grandma who's living with me, who's 82 years old, and she's constantly telling us how blessed we are and how fortunate we are and blah, blah, blah. And I'm starting to realize that. We need to appreciate everything that God has given us. Number 3, we need to attack our debt. Debt is the opposite of savings. Let me give you an example of this. The average car payment in America is $500 a month. That's the average, okay? Imagine you're age 25, and you decide that you're going to go into debt to buy a car. We have a car dealer here. He'll agree with this. So imagine you are 25 years old, you're going to go into debt, and you are going to buy this car. Your payment is going to be $500 a month. But instead, let's imagine that you don't go buy that fancy Escalade or that fancy F-250, and that you go pay cash for something that you can afford, and you instead take that $500 a month that you would have been paying to a car dealer or to a bank, and you save that $500 a month. If you're 25 and you do that until you're 65 years old, by the time that you retire or become 65, with interest involved in this, okay, you would have saved $1 million. So debt is the enemy of saving. Get this. The average young couple today spends $2,600 more a month than they make. Okay? I love this paraphrase. Proverbs 21 in the Good News Bible, the Good News translation says, "Stupid people spend money as fast as they get it." So by going into debt, we make it almost impossible to save. The fourth thing that I want you to understand, and Dave Ramsey spends a lot of time talking about this, you need to anticipate tough times. You never know when a wash machine is going to break, a car is going to break down, you're going to have a catastrophe at your house, a medical emergency. Anticipate those times. Plan for those times. The Bible warns us in Proverbs chapter 6 to prepare for tough times. It says this, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler. Yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." So you just got to understand that there is going to be some tough times that come up in your life. And Dave Ramsey and a lot of experts recommend that we have an extra savings account, emergency savings of at least 3 months of your income to be prepared for those catastrophes. Not that might happen, but that will happen at some point in your life. And quickly, number 5, the Bible teaches that the best way is to save money a little at a time. Let me tell you, I'm so proud of my grandma and grandpa. My grandpa was a preacher for 50 years. He passed away this September on my birthday, will be 14 years ago. But my grandma and grandpa came from absolutely nothing. My grandpa preached and tried to farm. He lost more money, my grandma told me, on cows and goats than he ever made. And I'm like, well, Samantha's like, well, that's where you get it from, Kurt. But my grandma babysat. At times she had up to 15 rugrats she took care of by herself. She was a penny pincher. Some of y'all, Brian, you want to know why I'm so tight at times? It's right there, I get it honest. She would pinch pennies. She'd save tin foil. She never threw a pizza box away, and she saved all her mayonnaise jars. She's been at our house, and after 4 or 5 days, I throw the leftovers out. I've got this bag of chicken in my refrigerator. It's been in there a week. I've been trying to feed it to the dog, and somehow it keeps finding its way back into the refrigerator. Finally, last night, I asked Samantha, I said, why is that barbecue chicken not fed to Coco yet? She said, your grandma keeps freezing, keep putting it back in there. She's going something with it. It's hilarious, and I pick on her and joke about it. But my grandparents always lived in a parsonage. I don't know their age, but at some point after I was born and was in middle school, this house and 6 acres of land came available on Port Republic Road in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And Grandpa really wanted it. He was going to have 6 acres of a cow pasture and an old barn and then a pretty good house. But he didn't have the money because he was a preacher. No retirement. Preachers don't get that. My grandma could tell that he really wanted this. She goes to a filing cabinet and takes out $60,000 in cash that she had saved and tucked away for years and years and years, and gave it to my grandpa to buy that. Well, Grandpa ended up dying years later. Looking back, we had the best memories, me and my 12 other grandchildren, playing on that 6 acres. Grandpa died. A little while later, Grandma realized that she needed to sell the land and the house and move to this area because this was the greatest concentration of family. We have a JMU student here today. But JMU came calling and knocking and bought that land, and Grandma and Grandpa nearly became millionaires. And they have given and gave more to the cause of Christ and to help people at the church than she'll ever admit, because she doesn't like people to know, but very proud. But she saved little by little, tucking it away in a filing cabinet, little by little. And God blessed them immensely. Little tidbit of information. They were able to buy some other land around Virginia, and none other than Allison Heights' husband's brother bought their farm. What's the little area called? Keysville, something. Anyway, Allison's husband's brother bought Grandma's other farm. And I believe Stephen actually lived in a townhouse on that property, if I'm not mistaken. I think that Stephen told me that. So it's just wild how it works. And it's true that if you just save a little at a time. Proverbs 13:11 says this: money that comes easily disappears quickly, but money that is gathered little by little will grow. And that's straight from the Bible, guys. The Bible tells us to save a little by little and to come up with a plan in your mind to do it and stick with that plan. But a great place to start is with this 10-10-80 plan, where you say, God, my first 10% is going to you and your kingdom. My second 10% is going in a filing cabinet or a bank account. And then 80% you live on. Here's what it might look like. Let me give you another example. Let's say you're 25 years old. Let's say you're married. You have a combined income of $60,000 a year. Now, of course, this fluctuates with IRAs or 401ks or how you invest it and what the interest rates are. But if you're 25 and you save till you're 65 and you have a combined income of just $60,000 a year, and you decide, we're going to do this 10-10-80 plan, here's what will happen by the time you're 65. You will have given $240,000 to the cause of Christ. With interest, whatever it is, and however you invest what you've saved, you could have anywhere from $2 to $5 million saved up. And I think most of us would say, that's great, sign me up, I'll do it. But I don't have the extra money to save. Remember, the Bible says, little by little it adds up. Let's say you go out to eat 5 days a week at work, and you spend on average $7 to $8 a meal for lunch. If you take that 1 day a week and you do not buy lunch that day, and you take that $7 or $8 and you put it in a Roth IRA, and you do that for 20 years, at the end of 20 years you will have $17,000. Do the math. Just little by little, you find that it makes a difference. Another example, I love Red Bulls. I drank 3 Thursday. $2.75 a can. Yeah. $2.75 a drink. That's drink money for you. If you take that $2.75 every single day, and you say, I'm going to start saving that. Let's take the number 25 years old again, and you do that till you're 65. You're a millionaire. Do the math. $2.75 times $3.65 times 40 years, plus interest. You got to have a plan. Well, as we close, let's go back to the story in Luke chapter 12. This guy, he's got all this money already. He gets more. He decides that the best thing for him to do with all this money he's raking in is to tear down his old barns and to build new, bigger barns. That's okay. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being rich. But in this story, Jesus uses this man as a bad example. Starting in verse 18, it says, Then he said, this is what I'm going to do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. I will say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So if you've saved and saved and saved, but you've not been rich towards God, Jesus says we're a fool. If we're saving up piles of money here on earth, you better make sure that your heavenly portfolio is doing okay too. Jesus calls this man a fool. And the only reason he calls him a fool is because he's not using what God has blessed him with to bless others. I mean, this man's got the biggest house in the neighborhood. He's got the biggest barns around. Yet he's not prepared for his own death. And I think God just looks at us when we do that. When we prepare for everything in this life, but we don't prepare for eternity. And I think he looks at us and he just shakes his head. So as the Bible says, we're not storing up for ourselves treasures here on earth, whereas Matthew says moth and rust will destroy and thieves will break in and steal. No, we're storing up for ourselves treasures in heaven, whereas Matthew also says moth and rust do not destroy and thieves can't break in and steal. Then he goes on and he says, where your treasure is, that's where you're going to find your heart. So as we close today, just make sure that your heavenly portfolio and your eternal savings account are being paid attention to. Don't get so caught up in storing up for yourself here on earth, on this side of eternity. Don't get caught up in buying bigger and building bigger barns. Don't get so caught up in building up your kingdom here. It's only going to last for a moment. Don't get so caught up in all that you overlook eternity and where you're going to spend it. So last week, 10% save, 10% give. This week, 10% save. Next week, we're going to look at 80%. Use it, pay your bills, have fun, and enjoy life. Right now, as we close, we're going to stand up. The girls are going to lead us. If you got a decision to make, you want to be baptized, you want to rededicate your life, or move your membership here to Mayo, you can meet me up front. But let's stand and worship the God that gave us everything we got.